Hello.
Hello, how are you?
Hello.
Hi there, how are you? From the Daily Aus, I'm Billi FitzSimons, and this is Young, Dumb and Informed. There is a federal election in the next 6 months, and we know it can sometimes feel like you need to learn a whole other language before you can understand what is happening inside Parliament House. So over the next 4 episodes, we'll give you the starter pack for some of the biggest political issues in Australia. For each episode, I'll speak to 3 different people with 3 different perspectives, because we want to give you the opportunity to hear from all sides of politics on these election-defining issues. We'll look at the challenges of accessing mental health services, the circus of Australia's climate change policies, the housing market crisis, and First Nations representation in the Australian Parliament.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows the rule on crops.
It's coal. It was dug up by men and women who work and live in the electorates of those who sit opposite.
Well, there's no action by Australia that's going to change the temperature of the globe at all.
Past. And the fact is that our climate and energy policies have cost us 2 recent elections.
Australia has already seen too many years of divisive politics around this issue. This Parliament needs to unite behind a common goal to keep our way of life and Australians safe.
Today we're exploring Australia's climate change policy, and it couldn't come at a more important time. 2 weeks ago, Prime Minister Scott Morrison announced Australia would formally be committing to net zero emissions by 2050. Climate change is also particularly topical right now as the Glasgow Climate Conference, also known as COP26, finishes up. Over the past week and a half, world leaders from nearly 200 countries have gathered to discuss their plans to tackle climate change. So today, we'll be hearing from 3 different perspectives on this critical issue. Firstly, I spoke to Matt Canavan.
Look, I'm a senator for Queensland. I'm currently in home quarantine here in Yeppoon, which is just near Rockhampton, where my office is. So I do represent the whole of Queensland, but I try and focus on central Queensland. There's no other senator from Brisbane to Townsville, so it's a big area. Lots going on in this part of the world, and it keeps me busy.
He's from the National Party, who are the junior partner of the Coalition. The Coalition is the makeup of 2 parties in Australia, the Liberal Party and the National Party, who market themselves as the Party for Regional Australia. So Matt Canavan is part of the Morrison government. And to give you context, the Nationals have long argued that action on climate change would disproportionately impact regional communities economically. So they've always been more hesitant to introduce climate action policies. I also spoke to Adam Band, who is the leader of the Greens.
I'm Adam Band. I'm the Federal Member of Parliament for Melbourne, and I'm the leader of the Greens. And I quit my job as a lawyer and started running in elections and got elected in politics for the Greens because of climate change. I wanted to see action on the climate crisis. And
the Greens are a minor party, which means they aren't one of the big 2, Liberal or Labor, but they do have 10 seats in Parliament, so they are important. Before I introduce you to the third person, I just want to say you might be wondering why I'm speaking to a politician from the Greens and a politician from the Nationals, considering neither of them are from Australia's 2 major parties. When it comes to climate change, the Greens and the Nationals are 2 really significant parties, especially when the Nationals are right now part of the elected government and have real influence over what Australia's climate change policies look like. At the Daily Aus, we believe it's important to hear an array of political perspectives, especially when they are elected officials, so that you can make a really informed decision when you're voting. So the third person I spoke to is a regional farmer from New South Wales. His name is Martin Murray.
Well, I'm Martin Murray. I'm 28 and I've got a farm up at Delungra in northwest New South Wales.
Martin has lived and worked in the middle of droughts and bushfires, the kind of extreme weather events scientists attribute to climate change.
So, we've had these fires, we've had this massive drought. It's wrapped up for most parts of the country now, and we've had a pretty couple of good runs. There still are some areas that are in drought. To me, it's that uncertainty from the climate perspective, from what we've been told. We're going to have more droughts. They're going to be worse. 2019 was the lowest rainfall year on record. Where we are at Delungra, we're in a sort of 650, 700 mil rainfall area. And in 2019, they had less than 100 mils. Just farming's untenable at that stage. And everyone was well and truly destocked and looking for sources of revenue elsewhere. And then, so that's, I guess, the climate impact.
Let's start the conversation with what I was talking about before. Australia has committed to net zero emissions by 2050, joining other countries like the US and the UK.
Australians want a plan that gets the balance right. And our plan to reach what will be our new official target of reaching net zero emissions by 2050, our plan gets the balance right.
And before we move on, let me explain exactly what that means. Net zero emissions means adding no greenhouse gases overall to the atmosphere. It doesn't necessarily mean not emitting any carbon dioxide. It just means balancing it out so that the net position is zero. So however much you put in, you also have to take out. So like I said, 2 weeks ago, Morrison outlined the plan to get Australia there.
Our plan is a fair plan. It's a practical plan. It's a responsible plan. Our plan for net zero by 2050 is the plan that I believe Australians want.
Although there has been widespread criticism that the plan A doesn't give a lot of detail and B doesn't tell us anything new because, as it says, it's based on existing policies.
And that plan is built on our existing policies. It's a plan that will not put industries...
Here's what Martin said about how he thinks it's being received in his regional community.
I think for the most part, people are pretty well on board with it, but, would like to see more detail. If anything, it probably should have come sooner, but it is what it is to an extent. So we're glad we're there, and we'd really like to see the detail so we can get into the nitty-gritty of what it means for our farms and our businesses.
Matt Canavan, remember, he's from the National Party and is currently in government, has been one of the most vocal critics of net zero. It's important to understand that because the Liberal Party is only in power because of the help of the National Party, it was hard for the Liberal Party to commit to the net zero emissions policy without the support of the Nationals. And gaining that support was a really long process due to the resistance from some of the Nationals, including Matt Canavan. The coalition government has announced a net zero by 2050 target recently. You've previously said that you were dead set against net zero emissions. Does this mean you voted against the net zero target? And if so, why?
I haven't voted against it at this stage, although I have promised to do so if it ever comes up in the Parliament.
Sorry, just in the party room meeting, the Nationals party room.
Yes, I spoke against it. We didn't have a formal vote in that meeting, but yes, definitely spoke against it. And I'll continue to speak against it because I don't think it is the right priority for Australia right now.
So Matt Canavan says he's against net zero, but remember the Morrison government has committed to it. I know in an interview earlier this year you said net zero emissions was a slogan, not a policy. Do you still believe that?
Look, I believe that even more now after seeing the saga that has been the Glasgow Climate Conference. This stuff, it's as I've compared it to a sort of corporate slogan. I used to work for a big corporation, and you used to put up with words like synergy and thought leadership, and these sort of buzzwords really always get up my goat. And net zero emissions is another buzzword. It means lots of different things to lots of different people, but I don't think the government's policy is the right one. I think it is based on far too much hope and promise than reality.
It probably doesn't come as a surprise that the Greens' perspective is wildly different. Actually, they both agree that they don't like Australia's net zero by 2050 target, but they don't like it for extremely different reasons. Adam Band believes that net zero is absolutely necessary, but he believes that to do it by 2050 is just way too late. He says that to have a meaningful impact on lessening the effects of climate change on the globe, we need to reach net zero way before.
2050 is too late. What matters is what we do by 2030, like this decade, right now, when the government is in power. Pushing action out to 2050 is too late. And look, delay is the new denial. And there's a reason that Scott Morrison and others are prepared to talk about 2050, because they know that they might not even be around by then, and they certainly won't be in power in government by then, and so they can push action out until it is too late. 2030 is the climate's deadline. That's what the world scientists have made absolutely clear. And the reason that this climate summit in Glasgow is so important is that everyone from around the world is being called in and asked to do more by 2030. Forget about 2050. They're all being told, if we don't cut our world's pollution by about half by 2030, then the window to stop dangerous climate change may close, right? It may be too late. And this is the thing about the climate crisis and what scientists have been at pains to tell us for a long time. At a certain point, you go over the edge of the cliff.
Matt Canavan doesn't agree that climate change should be a priority for the government in the next decade. Let's move on from 2050. A lot of scientists say that 2050 is too late. Do you believe that climate action is needed in the next 10 years?
Look, I think it's sensible to be reducing emissions, and we have been and are doing that, but I don't see climate change is a major crisis for the world right now. There's just, as I say, no evidence for that.
But I just want to say, like, the fires that Australia recently saw, that scientists everywhere said that was as a result of climate change. So you don't believe that was a result of climate change?
Look, I very much am guided by the science that's in the IPCC reports, and you've got to read through the individual chapters of those documents to get to the science.
I just want to jump in here. The IPCC report is very clear that climate change is a code red for humanity. There was also a Royal Commission last year, which found, quote, climate change has already increased the frequency and intensity of extreme weather and climate systems that influence natural hazards. It also said the 2019 and 2020 bushfire season demonstrated that bushfire behaviour is becoming more extreme and less predictable.
And there still is no scientific evidence that the bushfires have increased as a result of climate change.
But you have to agree that overwhelmingly scientists agree that climate change is real and it is impacting extreme weather.
I'm not saying it's not real.
Events.
I'm not saying it's not real. Well, no, I'm not saying it's not real, but I am saying there's very little evidence that climate change is causing significant increases in extreme weather.
Before we move on, you might be wondering, after listening to this, does Matt Canavan even believe in climate change? I asked him. Just to be clear, if you say that you don't believe that climate change has led to more extreme weather events, doesn't that mean that you don't believe in climate change?
No, I mean, I thought this just before we move, I learnt all this at school and went through it, but wasn't the issue of the greenhouse gas effect increase in temperatures? I mean, it used to be called global warming, right?
Temperatures, which is then resulting in more extreme weather events such as bushfires.
No. The more extreme weather events come later because what used to be called global warming, and then they changed the name because they wanted to scare people on other things as well. They're very good at language and all these things.
Who's they?
Pushing this. Well, people, the activists that are pushing this, right? There's a whole industry pushing.
Scott Morrison, Barnaby Joyce, they talk about climate change.
Not Scott
But
Morrison.
they say climate change.
But there's a whole industry. I mean, do you know where the word net zero emissions came from a corporation or a group of people led by Richard Branson, right? They latched onto a term that was carbon neutrality and sort of changed that and got to net zero emissions. I mean, we never spoke of net zero emissions until it was about 5 or 6 years ago. It sort of became common in the lingo. Well, not that long ago. And 20 years ago, as I say, we were talking about global warming. No one ever spoke about climate change. That shifted. Now, so in terms of global warming,
I'm not talking about the specific words. I'm talking about what.
Okay, yeah. And you wanted to know, do I think climate change is real? Well, or whatever you want to call it. Absolutely, there's been an increase in temperatures, and absolutely, some of that increase is due to human activity of increased carbon emissions. The other issue here, and the real reason I think people have latched onto extreme weather events, is the increase in temperatures has not been as severe as was expected. And it's not as...
But where is the evidence for that? Because that's just not what scientists are saying, the overwhelming majority of scientists.
Well, the evidence is clear. So this is the way science...
Now, here's what Adam Bandt said when I asked him about the Nationals specifically.
Under the Nationals and Liberals policy, if we keep going the way that we are, we're going to see worse droughts. The floods, when they hit, are going to be worse. We're going to see rivers starting to dry up. We're going to see areas that sustain at the moment crops and agriculture get hotter and hotter to the point where it's going to be difficult to grow the same kind of things that we do at the moment. The biggest threat to Australian farmers and livelihoods is the climate crisis getting worse. But that's what the Nationals have in mind. So the only way we're going to be able to keep farmers on the land...
I read out part of Adam Bandt's answer to Matt Canavan. He disagreed.
No, absolutely not. What I want to do is grow and develop our nation, because that is good for Australian people and it's good for the world. It's good for the world.
And you want to do that by investing in fossil fuels?
Well, I think if the world wants and gets use out of fossil fuels, absolutely we should supply it. And clearly they do. I mean, look what's happening right now across the world when we're seeing a shortage of fossil fuels.
Why don't we step away from the political perspectives for a minute and get back to what Martin Murray, the farmer from regional New South Wales, had to say about how climate change impacts his livelihood.
Very heavily. I'm fairly well leveraged, so carrying a lot of debt, and that debt's got to be serviced. As I said earlier, I work off farm as well, so that reduces some of that risk. But I still work in agriculture, so it's very unlikely that if I'm struggling on the farm due to drought, the day job wouldn't be struggling as well due to drought as well. It's the effects aren't just localised to one property or one area. They're felt throughout the entire regional economy.
So that's how he's currently being impacted, but he also holds serious concerns about the economic impacts he might feel from Australia's reputation in global markets.
The other side of the pennies, I guess, the market risk. It's what trade implications are we going to be exposed to? There's a lot of talk, as you'd be well aware, of the EU carbon adjustment tax or offset, however they want to define it. And then there's other schemes that, as a grower, without those sort of taxes, we're already required to be involved in. For example, if I grow canola, and I do from time to time, I did last year.
Essentially here, Martin is saying that as international markets move towards endorsing more environmentally friendly policies, Aussie goods could get more expensive for overseas buyers, making them less desirable. In some cases, a way that countries are putting pressure on other nations to come to the table on climate change is to impose higher taxes on products bought from nations who they believe have poor climate policies. For example, from 2026, the European Union will apply an extra charge on imported iron ore, one of Australia's biggest exports, from countries without a carbon tax. Not good news for Australian miners.
And basically that it's aimed at bringing our farming practices and our standards in line with the EU's. There are some issues there, particularly some new regulations they're looking to bring in regards to pollinators, but it's just an example of that market access position, which, regardless of whether you believe in climate change or not, is obviously something that's going to impact you as a producer.
This is a really important point. Australia is a huge exporter of fossil fuels to international markets. But if international markets are moving towards cleaner energy, isn't it inevitable that we'll need to phase out coal? Here's what Matt Canavan said. We've seen that more than 40 countries have pledged to phase out coal. Will Australia be left behind with no one to buy our coal?
Well, I haven't been through the whole list of those 40, but my understanding is the big coal consuming and producing countries have not signed up. So I doubt it very much. This century alone, the last 20 years, coal demand is up 60%. I mean, 60% was already very high in the year 2000 too. It wasn't growing off a low base.
But in terms of the targets that other countries have set out.
Yeah, I always believe in life that you're much better off trusting what people do compared to what they say. You're much better in life looking at how people act than how they talk, because talk is cheap.
Okay, so far we've focused a lot on what the current government's policy is, but let's hear what an alternative policy could look like. So the Greens want to deliver 100% renewable energy by 2030. What's your plan to get us there? Like, what are the tangible steps to get us there?
Look, we actually want to deliver 700% renewable energy by 2030. We want to get 100% of our electricity renewables, and that involves legislated planned closure of all our coal-fired power stations between now and 2030 and replacement of those with renewables and batteries and other forms of storage. So we need a target in law that says, here's when we know our coal-fired power stations are going to come out of the system and when we're going to bring in renewables instead. And with that kind of certainty, it allows communities and workers to plan so that no one's left in the lurch.
So the Greens want to legislate climate action targets. They want to make it law, which is an approach the current government has pushed back on. The Greens also want to redirect the money that is currently going into fossil fuel production to instead go into renewable energy.
We need the handouts at the moment that are going to the big coal and gas corporations that cost billions of dollars a year. We need to redirect those into things like renewables and storage and batteries so that we can get ourselves running on renewables here.
So one of the biggest questions people have when the Greens talk about ambitious climate action policies is how much it will cost. And we can't pretend like it won't impact the economy, considering coal is one of Australia's largest exports. So last year, 24% of Australia's electricity came from renewable energy. To get to 100% in less than a decade, or 700%, as you say, would be an incredibly quick transition. How much will it cost Australia to do that?
Yeah, we have done the costings, and I'll come back to that in a second, but they put someone on the moon in 10 years when they said we want to do it, and they put the country's best and brightest people onto it, and they said it's a national priority and we're going to put money into it. They made it happen, and the money is there in the system. It's just at the moment it's going to the wrong places. And my point is,
how much would it cost to achieve that 700%?
Well, you'd be looking at around somewhere in the order of Australia's debt growing by about $20 billion a year over the next decade. And bear in mind, we spent much, much more than that to get through COVID. We're talking about something that's eminently affordable, and it's just paid for by making the billionaires pay more tax and stop giving handouts to the billionaire corporations. But it's something that is actually eminently affordable compared with the costs of the climate crisis, the costs that we've seen from the bushfires, with floods, the costs of basically not being able to feed ourselves because droughts are going to ravage our country if we don't tackle the climate crisis very quickly. It's much, much cheaper than the costs of inaction, and it's going to create a lot of jobs and drive down power prices along the way.
So as a minor party, if the Greens were to get into government, it would be with the Labor Party. It doesn't happen often, but it did happen after the 2010 election when Labor Prime Minister Julia Gillard signed a formal agreement with the Greens to form government. So I asked Adam Bandt to explain that relationship a bit more. Can you explain your relationship with Labor? Because I think something that I hear a lot from my friends is that they kind of see you as the same because you're both left of centre. Can you explain that relationship?
The biggest thing that we've got to do at the moment to tackle the climate crisis, as I've said, is stop coal and gas, phase it out and replace it with renewables. But Liberals and Labor both want more coal and gas, right? They both want more coal and gas, and they're both expanding them at a time when we can't do it. The Liberals are worse. Like, the Liberals are full of active climate deniers who don't want Australia to take the action that is needed. And also they do many other things that the Greens find terrible as well, like attack people on low incomes, attack people who are doing it tough, and attack refugees. So we want to kick the Liberals out, but Labor, left to their own devices, they will expand coal and gas. They will keep taking the donations from the big coal and gas corporations, and they will make the climate crisis worse.
Okay, so I've spoken to opposite sides of Australian politics here, who both claim to be representing the interests of regional Australia. So I had one last question for Martin. As a person in regional Australia, does he feel like his interests are being represented in Parliament?
Look, it looks like things are starting to move in a better direction. It's very early days. Obviously, we've just had this net zero agreement, and there's still a lot of detail to come out of the woodwork there as to what's going on. But there's also a lot of opportunities, whether that be through carbon trading or biodiversity schemes. But again, it's good to see that these options are there, but it's hard to say whether they're good, bad or indifferent until we get some detail around them and I'm able to run numbers on my property.
As you can see, climate action is clearly shaping up to be an election-defining issue, and there's a wide spectrum of political perspectives. For young Australians, we have a lot to think about when it comes to climate policy, because after all, we are the ones who will be living in a very different environment to the one we know now. Thank you so much for listening to Young, Dumb and Informed. If you have enjoyed hearing today's episode, we'd love it if you could share it with your friends so they can be more informed too in the lead up to the next federal election. We'll see you next week.